Hey everyone, it's Mr. Hefner, like always. And today I want to give you a little background on the historical time period for A Tale of Two Cities. We've probably, at this point in the course, we've probably already talked about the time period when the author Charles Dickens was alive, but we're going to go back before the time of his birth and take a look at what was going on in what we call the French Revolution of 1789. Now, I geek out over history, you know that, and this is probably longer than it needs to be. If you're taking notes or something like that, what I want you to think about is things that relate to A Tale of Two Cities. So we're not going to study the entire French time period, but part of what we're studying with Charles Dickens is his ability to see people at different social levels and understand that things like villains are made, and that when societies don't address their problems, they often kind of blow up into bigger problems. And so he's using this book to address some of the issues that are going on during his own lifetime uh, in England by writing about the French Revolution. But it's not a story about the French Revolution. It's a story about Charles and Lucy and Sidney and Mr. Lorry and Miss Pross and Madame Defarge and all of the other characters. The French Revolution is just simply the backdrop for it. So what I want you to look for is the big ideas here, not the little tiny details. So let's get started. Okay, so here we are. Like I said in the intro, we're going to talk about this as the French Revolution of 1789. And that's so that we don't confuse it with other French revolutions. Unlike the United States, we've had one revolution. The French had several of them. And so this is the one that we call the Revolution of 1789. And we're going to take a look at some of the events that caused it, and then what happened as it was underway. And that's going to serve as the backdrop for the most exciting portion of A Tale of Two Cities. Now, the king that gets referenced in A Tale of Two Cities is Louis the 16th. And hopefully you studied up on your Roman numerals. So that would be this guy right here, Louis the 16th. So we've got a 10 plus a 5 plus a 1, that makes 16. And his wife, who was Queen Marie Antoinette, and Marie Antoinette is actually Austrian. So it was a political arranged marriage between the two of them. She was not very well liked by the French people. But the revolution really, some would say, goes all the way back to Louis XIV. His nickname was the Sun King, and he fought a lot of foreign wars to build wealth for himself. He liked castles, he liked gold, which is why he got the nickname the Sun King. And that led to a lot of debt for France, passed much of this on to the people. Louis XV continued some of the same practices. There's, according to Thomas Carlyle, there's a story that on his deathbed, Louis XV began to regret what he had done to the people of France, called his son by his side and said, don't be like I was, respect the people of France. You're like a father to them. You must take care of your people. Now, Louis XVI runs into a problem where France is really struggling financially, and he needs to do something for the country. And so he tries something which seems pretty smart on the surface. He calls a meeting of an organization which is called the Estates Generales. Now, the Estates Generales has not met in anyone's lifetime. It's an older organization for advising the king, and no kings have used it. Nobody is alive who ever before met with the Estates General. It's made up of three houses. So you understand the idea of houses in government. We have a bicameral government. We have the Senate, and we have the Congress. This wasn't a legislative body, though. This body, the Estates General, could only advise the king. The king was sovereign, and the king made all the decisions for the country. But it was made up of these three houses, and the first estate, they called them estates, not houses, was made up of 300 members of mostly clergy. So they would be religious leaders. And at the time, France was still part of the Holy Roman Empire. So the idea was that the church was supreme. And so the clergy is going to have a strong kind of influence here. The second estate is made up of noble people. People through their birth are born into a good bloodline kind of thing. You can't work your way up to nobility. And the third estate, that word is pronounced bourgeois, at least that's the closest I can come to it, the commoners. These are your middle class folks. Now, you notice that there are 600 of them, as opposed to only 200 in the second estate and only 300 in the clergy. And that's going to lead to a problem. Here's a period painting of a meeting of the Estates General. This would be all three estates meeting together. So you're looking at approximately 1,200 people meeting here. When we have an assembly in the auditorium at Conrad Weiser High School and it's completely full, we have about 1,000 people in the auditorium. So you could add about another 200 and you have your meeting of the Estates General. This first estate, as I said, was made up largely of people in the clergy. They represented wealth and prominence because they catered to that particular group. And because they provided education and represented the church, they had a certain degree of censorship powers. They could say what could not be printed and could not be said publicly and could punish those who violated that. And then your second estate, these noble people, they're born into money, but they make money oftentimes by renting out the land that they have, letting others use it, and then collecting taxes on that. They themselves pay no taxes at all. And they are also essentially the government. They hold most of the political offices and the courts in those days. Judges want jobs as judges. You've got to kind of take care of the right people. And so the second estate, the bulleted item here says they owned the courts. What that basically means is someone of that stature generally wouldn't have faced any sort of severe punishment going in front of a judge. Now, this third estate, which is the biggest of the three estates, is your middle class. And even though there are 600 members, here's the problem I alluded to. They still have 1/3 of the voting power. Each house essentially has one vote in the end. And the problem here is that the first two estates have common interests. The third estate has a wholly separate set of interests, but they're always outvoted 2-1 by the other two states. Now you can imagine if you bring a group to meet and discuss and vote, and they're always outvoted, this is probably going to cause conflict, not resolve conflict. And so what happens is at one point, the third estate, who realizes we're never going to get anywhere as long as we have to work with the other two estates, they simply declare themselves to be a new organization, and they declare themselves to be the National Assembly. This all comes out of an earlier period of time from the late 1600s into the early 1700s called the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment was essentially a philosophy that said, think, work hard, learn, understand the world and how it works, and you can rise above. Many people, other than philosophers, didn't really buy into that until the American Revolution came along. You see, people like Thomas Jefferson and John Adams and Patrick Henry were students of the Enlightenment. They read the great philosophers, and you can read the things they read almost word for word, sometimes borrowed, showing up right in documents like the Declaration of Independence or the United States Constitution. The American Revolution was successful. The common people rose up, overthrew a king, and instituted their own government. The American Revolution, in a way, is sort of like encouragement for a French Revolution. And here, the National Assembly, it sounds very democratic, sounds very American, was declared on June 17th of 1789. It's not the start of the revolution officially yet, that's coming up. And the members of the National Assembly do this, and then one day they go to meet and they find that their meeting hall has been closed down. This crowd understands that they've basically been shut down by the king. And so on a rainy day, they wander the streets looking for a building that, this sounds very dramatic, I know, but they wander the streets looking for a building that would be big enough for them to all meet. And they find a vacant tennis court, indoor tennis court. And they go in there. And at this point, they swear an oath, which to this day is known as the tennis court oath. And the oath basically says that they will continue to meet no matter what until they have a new constitution in place for France. This is certainly starting to sound like revolution because the king is not for this. August 4th, there was a member of this group, I think you pronounce his name Vicomte de Niles, and he basically, well, here, I'll show it to you. He basically says that we should give up all noble titles. No one should be like the Marquis anymore. We'll just all be citizen. And the tennis court oath, which was in French, is basically, let us swear to God and our country that we will not disperse until we've established a sound and just constitution. We're going to keep meeting until we've changed our government. This is a famous painting by Jacques-Louis David, and it was painted pretty much in the middle of the French Revolution. But you see how dramatic it is. Everybody's voting and swearing the tennis court oath as the wind blows the curtains up in the galleries. It looks very, very dramatic there. This is where it gets a little confusing here. Details, again, are not going to matter. There was a document called The Rights of Man that French citizens were reading, and it was very much an inspiring document, the idea that you can rise up and form your own government. There were two documents very similar that had rights of man in their title. If you're a Hamilton fan, you know there's a line in the show where Thomas Jefferson returns from France and he says, I helped Lafayette write a declaration and then I said I got to go, or something like that. Maybe I should wrap it for you. That was the one. And the other one was written by Thomas Paine. And that's the one I believe we're talking about here. Now, you might remember Thomas Paine from American history as a pamphleteer, British born, moved to America, and he wrote Common Sense, the pamphlet which pretty much convinced at least half of American citizens, colonists, that it made sense to have a revolution right now and rise up against the king before the king had an entire army in the New World. It used logic and it used Enlightenment ideas. After the American Revolution is over, Thomas Paine sort of fell out of favor in America. He went on a big kick kind of speaking about deism. Deism is the idea that there is a God, but God does not control our daily lives. We're kind of on our own here. A lot of people saw that as anti-religion, and he kind of fell out of favor at that point. The reality is many of America's leaders at the time were deists. They just didn't speak out in favor of it as strongly as Thomas Paine did. And Thomas Paine then went off to England, where he wrote a few documents that got him in trouble with the crown. An order was put out for his arrest. He fled England, went to France. He wrote The Rights of Man. He couldn't even speak French. He became a hero amongst them, and he actually served in the French government as an official for the people, just simply because he was that influential. Later on, unfortunately, kind of jumping ahead here, but when the guillotine comes, you remember that from A Tale of Two Cities, Thomas Paine was against capital punishment. He was a humanist kind of guy, and he wrote pamphlets against capital punishment. The people and Robespierre loved their guillotine, and so ultimately they threw Thomas Paine in prison there as well. So poor Thomas Paine, he got himself in so much trouble with his words, but he was also so influential. So we talked about the American Revolution. By 1791, there's a new constitution kind of it's been drafted by the National Assembly, and the king signs it. Now, speaking of Lafayette, he's taking this horse by the reins. Anyway, I'm not going to do that. Actually, I just did, I guess. This is the same Lafayette who, as a teenager, came to America to fight alongside George Washington. And he's now gone back to France. And even though he's of noble birth, he danced with Queen Marie Antoinette when he was just a young boy. Even though he is a nobleman, he believes in this cause. He fought for it in the American Revolution. And so he gives up his noble title, and he's going to serve the people. And he's going to become the head of their army, the People's Army, at least for a little while anyway. What happens is on July 13th, 1789, spontaneously, some soldiers in the King's Army simply decide we're forming a People's Army. It's about 48,000 troops, and Lafayette is going to be the head of this group. The problem is, while they have sidearms, they have pistols and muskets and things like that, they don't have any artillery. And so they decide, where can we get artillery? I know, we can get artillery from the Bastille. Now, let's talk about what the Bastille is. The Bastille used to be, in the Middle Ages, it was a fortification outside the city of Paris to protect it in case there was an attack. Well, since that time, Paris had grown up so big that the Bastille had actually been absorbed with inside the city at this point, and it had been converted to a prison. It was largely a political prison, which meant that if you offended someone, you could be thrown in here. Now, what do I mean, offended someone? You didn't even get a trial. What I'm saying is there was, here it is, it's right here. this thing called letters de cachet. Now, he's going to play into A Tale of Two Cities. So this is one of those little bitty points that is important. Letters de cachet were like blank forms. You know, years ago when I was at Conrad Weiser, if a student caused a problem, a teacher could just simply fill out a detention form and hand a copy over. You know, you didn't get to go to court. You didn't get to argue your case. You were given a detention form. You had to serve a detention. That's sort of what letters de cachet were. If a noble person decided to lock you up for a while, he could just simply fill one of these out and off you went to prison. No trial. And you didn't get out until he said you could get out. Sometimes people just disappeared from society this way. Now, the people believed at the time that this prison was full of innocents who had been thrown in there on these letters de cachet. And while that's not true, there were only 6 people, 6 prisoners in the Bastille at the time this all happened, unlike what you read in Tale of Two Cities. What they thought is reality, right? Mobs act on the idea that situations are emotional and exciting. This is the kind of fort that nobody would have thought it could have been, captured by just people with pistols and muskets and things like that. The walls were 100 feet high, and they did have these cannons which use something called case shot. It basically takes a cannon and turns it into an absolutely giant anti-personnel shotgun. Bloody, horrible weapons of the time. Here's another period painting in the public domain now of the storming of the Bastille. The story goes that what happened, according to Thomas Carlyle anyway, the story goes here that what happened was the people came to the Bastille and they wanted some cannons. The governor of the Bastille, a guy by the name of Delaunay, he was a gentleman. He invited a committee to come in and meet with him. Let's talk about this. And the committee went inside and the drawbridge was raised again and the angry mob waited outside. Well, if Carlyle's right, Delaunay ordered that a meal was prepared so they could all sit down and discuss this over the meal. Well, in the meanwhile, the crowd, not people used to such genteel manners, was getting angrier and angrier. So that by the time the committee finally left the Bastille and the drawbridge was lowered, the angry crowd just rushed across the drawbridge into the courtyard of the Bastille. The guards who were there, they were mostly Swiss guards at the time. They were guards that were hired by the king, the mercenaries, to protect him. He didn't always trust his own army, so he had hired guards. But there were a lot of Swiss guards here. Most of the guards had gone home for the day. The guards that were there started firing on the crowds, and Delaunay ordered them to stop. And unfortunately, the crowd had been only incensed more by the shooting. They went wild. They slaughtered the guards. They captured Delaunay, and they killed him. We call this Bastille Day, and it is officially the French Independence Day. We in America say that our American Revolution started with the signing of the Declaration of Independence on July 4th, 1776, but shots had been fired before that. It's a symbolic event that we can kind of all gather around. Obviously, things had been happening to get this French Revolution underway. 100 years after the storming of the Bastille, the French government decided, let's make this our Independence Day, our Bastille Day. And ultimately, the Bastille was then destroyed. It was torn down as this symbol of oppression that was here. Yeah, it was 1880. 1880, that Bastille Day was named as the French Independence Day. And it's still celebrated every July 14th to this day. So it was July 16th that they approved it, but it's July 14th every year that it's celebrated. By October, what's going on is the economic conditions in France haven't gotten any better. And in Paris, there's a group of angry, largely women, who cannot feed their families. They're fed up with the whole situation. And they realize that the king and his family are living in luxury just outside the city of Paris at the Palace of Versailles. And so they start marching out there to demand that they be given food. And as they march, the crowd grows, more and more people, angrier people, to the point where a crowd of estimated at 6,000 arrive at the palace out there. The king is in hiding. Ultimately, some shots are fired. The king orders it stopped. He wants to know what's going on. He realizes the people want food, and he has the entire stores of the palace at Versailles emptied and everything given to the people. But at this point, it's not enough to satisfy them. And so by the time this is all over, the people demand that the king come with them back to Paris that in these troubled times, he shouldn't be living out here in the countryside in such luxury while they're suffering in town. And so, in a way, this is where the king starts to be almost like a prisoner of the people. And Lafayette, who was a friend of the king, I told you as a boy he danced with Queen Marie Antoinette. There's a funny story that he wasn't very good and he stepped on the queen's foot, and it was terribly embarrassing because he wasn't a good dancer. Um, but Lafayette promises the king, "Come with me now, and I will keep you safe." And unfortunately, that's a promise that even Lafayette can only keep so long, and then it's out of his control. There's the Palace of Versailles today. This was, I should have the documentation up here. This was just a photo I took off Google Photos, and it was actually an individual person who posted some vacation pictures. So that's just a tourist shot. But this was in the little village of Versailles outside Paris. It's still there today. You might recognize the name Versailles from the Treaty of Versailles at the end of World War I. This was the location that was used for the negotiating and the signing of the treaty that finally ended the armistice and put World War I behind us. Now, this is another story from Carlyle that seems a little too dramatic to be believed, but I'll tell you anyway. 1791, the king realizes things are totally out of control. I've got to get out of Paris. Maybe I can escape to Austria and my brother-in-law will take care of me. And the family, the king, the queen, their child, known as the Dauphin because he's the next in line to be king, they get dressed in ordinary, middle-class clothing in a middle-class carriage, and they're going to try to escape and get across the border. The legend has it that they had almost made it, and they had stopped at a point where they had to pay a toll. And when the king handed over money to pay the toll, someone recognized that the picture on the money was the same as the man who was paying. Now that sounds a little ridiculous to me, but it's one of those stories people still tell today. And so the authorities were alerted, the king was captured, and now the people don't trust him. From here on out, the king will be watched by the people. He literally has now become a prisoner in his own country. Now, on April 25th of 1792, we're still in the Tale of Two Cities time period, the guillotine gets its first use. It's not being used by the revolution. It's a device that was actually proposed by the man on the picture, Dr. Joseph Guillotine. Guillotine would be the way it's pronounced, I believe. He was a physician, a doctor. And as a doctor, he swore a Hippocratic oath that it was his duty to ease suffering. He felt that executions were sometimes botched, they didn't go well, and there was a lot of suffering. And he basically wanted to create a machine that would execute people without pain. And while he didn't do the engineering of the machine, he was the one who proposed it. Engineers worked on it. It was built. And in 1792, the guillotine gets used for the first time to chop off a head. The king in Paris is staying at a palace called the Tuileries. It's the palace that is located right at the Louvre Museum. If you ever go to Paris, they're side by side there. It was built by Louis XIV. It's still in use for various functions today. But the king is there when some members of an angry crowd actually get into the palace. Whether they're trying to get to the king or not, we don't know, but the king and his family go into hiding. The Swiss guard begins firing on the crowd. The king orders them to stop firing on his people. Remember what Louis XV said to him on his deathbed. He says, stop firing into, the crowd of my people. Again, the incensed crowd kills the guards, and the servants are all slaughtered just because they were serving the king. So they must be horrible, terrible people. And now the king is really the prisoner of the people. There's an image of the outside of the Tuileries. At this point, the Austrian king is trying to help out here, and a war is underway between Austria, Prussia, and France is going to get into this as well. So Prussia is what we would call Germany today. And so they're going to be fighting. The Legislative Assembly is going to fight back. The People's Army is now fighting the revolution against the king, but they're fighting external forces. This guy by the name of Napoleon is going to make a good name for himself as a soldier at this time. And at this point, Louis XVI gets accused of treason against his own people. And again, remember, the queen is Austrian, and the French people do not like her. So the family is going to be thrown in a prison, and they're not going to be cared for particularly well. Lafayette realizes things are out of control here. He's going to try to escape and go off to Austria. Unfortunately, because of his connections with the revolution, he's going to be captured by the Austrians and thrown into an Austrian prison. He's going to spend several really miserable years treated very badly in an Austrian prison. So we often forget we don't think of what happened to Lafayette after the American Revolution, but quite a bit did. And part of it, unfortunately, he's going to spend a number of years in prison. Ultimately, the people have a trial for the king, kind of the ultimate impeachment, I guess. They've stripped him of his title. He's no longer King Louis. They call him King Louis Capet. I've read that he's called Capet just simply because that means head or person. He was the head of the country. I've read other sources that said it was an ancient family name that they brought back. I don't know. I don't know enough about history to do my own original research, and it doesn't really matter for our purposes here. But they're going to hold the trial in 1792, and Louis is going to be convicted of crimes against the people of France, and he's going to be sentenced to death. This trial, we've had an impeachment in your recollection, the time of your recollection, and you know that our two houses, two parties anyway, in the Senate didn't necessarily cooperate and work together. At this time, the revolutionaries also have two groups. A group calling themselves the Jacobins. They're much more radical. They want to get rid of the king and completely change everything. And the Girondins, who want to just make things better. And if that means having a king yet, okay. Philosophically, they don't agree on everything, but they work together to prosecute the king and convict the king. And like I said, they're successful. The king's execution is going to happen at 10 a.m. on January 21st, 1793. He is taken in the royal coach, very well guarded. He's treated with the utmost of dignity. Up at the guillotine, his hands are tied behind his back. And again, from Thomas Carlyle, there's a story that as they're about to execute him, he raises a hand, probably before they tie them behind his back, quiets the crowd, and starts to speak. And says something in French like, I die innocent, I pardon my enemies, and I hope that my blood will be useful to the French and that it will appease God's anger. Now, those are some pretty noble words for someone to, about to have his head removed from his body. But the executioner calls for the drum roll, the king is put down, his head is removed from his body, and his body is taken away. The queen is still alive. His son, the Dauphin, is still alive, but their deaths are coming too, and they're not going to be with the same dignity that the kings had. While all this is going on, Britain comes into the war as well, and France is now fighting Prussia, fighting Austria, fighting Britain. This obviously costs a lot of money to fight these wars. And this sounds a little strange. I throw it in here because I think it's more philosophical. In the middle of all this turmoil, France decides, let's adopt the metric system. Now, in my lifetime, the United States has tried very strongly once, and other times has proposed, let's move to the metric system, and it always fails. We've got little bits of it now around. Every once in a while, you buy, like a 2-liter bottle instead of, a half gallon or something like that. But for the most part, we still buy gallons of gas, and we buy a dozen of this and things like that. We haven't really moved to the metric system. Why move to the metric system right now? Well, because the other system was an imperial system. Measurements were based on things like the length of the king's arm, and so the idea of the metric system is it's not offensive to any person, any citizen. It's fair for everybody. These measurements are based on facts about the world and the earth and measurements and science, and that's part of the Enlightenment. So just throw that in there. Poor Marie Antoinette. She didn't have a choice about marrying Louis. It was a political arrangement. There's a story that when she first met him, she looked at him and people could see her disappointment in him. But it's October 16th, 1793, getting close to a year after her husband was executed. She's ill. She has not been taken care of. She's received very harsh treatment in prison, including psychological trauma. One of her friends, a Princess de Lamballe, had been executed, and some people kept the head. And they would literally put the head on a pike and wave it outside her window so she would see it there as a reminder of what was going to be coming to her. She was taken to the place of execution in a common farm cart, as they use in A Tale of Two Cities, you know, again for Sidney when he's taken at the end of the story. The crowd jeered, they threw things. As she stood up at the guillotine, at one point, they went to start cutting off some of her hair because they would often cut off hair and sell it. And when they pulled off her wig, they realized she had already removed her own hair just so she could not do that. And she had lost much of her hair while she was in prison as well. Um, there's, again, from Carlyle, there's a story that as the executioner brought her over to put her into position to be executed, she stepped on his foot and apologized. She apologized to her executioner because she didn't mean to do it, kind of thing. Pardon me, sir, I did not mean to do it. By the way, there's a picture. She was only 16 in this particular portrait. So she was older than that by the time she was executed. Now, from this point on, the king is gone. The queen is gone. The Dauphin is going to die a boy in prison. Later on, he gets credit for being Louis XVII, but he dies in prison and never actually comes to the throne. At this point, someone named Maximilian Robespierre is going to rise to power, and the Jacobins seize power over the Girondins, and the Jacobins begin even capturing and executing the Girondins that we talked about. The idea here was anyone who challenges this revolution, just accuse them, give them a sham trial, and cut off their heads so that power can be maintained. The revolutionaries have now become the oppressors. It's completely turned around. They've replaced one oppressor with another. There's, during this period called the Reign of Terror, if you remember in A Tale of Two Cities, there's this one scene where the Manettes are staying at their lodgings in France, and there's a courtyard, and an angry crowd rushes in and sharpens their farm tools on a grindstone. The chapter's called The Grindstone, and then they run out. And then later on, they come in to sharpen their weapons that have become dull, but they're bloody weapons now. And you have this idea that they become dull as they're just executing the aristocracy. This is all part of the Reign of Terror. And executions happened on a regular basis. They happened so much. Originally, the guillotine was in a wealthy part of town so that the wealthy could see what was coming to them. But the smell of blood soaking into the streets and kind of cooking in the hot sun became so offensive that they moved the guillotine to the poorest part of Paris, which is where it is in A Tale of Two Cities. It's why Madame Defarge and her friend the Vengeance spend so much time there watching executions. Now, Robespierre eventually gained so much power that even some of his confidants realized he needs to be removed. He needs to be removed from power. They couldn't bring it up. They couldn't talk to him about it because execution became, almost inevitable at that point. And so he was secretly captured. In trying to capture them, Carlyle tells us that he was shot in the jaw so that his jaw was hanging down. They tied it in place and they took the wounded Robespierre that night to his trial. He was tried, unable to speak, lying in agony on a table, convicted and taken to be executed, to be beheaded at the same guillotine he had ordered for so many others the next day. And again, very dramatic if it's true. Right before his execution, he reached up, he ripped off the bandage, his jaw dropped down, and he glared at the crowd before they put him down and decapitated him. So we usually think the Reign of Terror starts with the execution of Louis XVI, and it runs through the execution of Robespierre. Now, we are beyond, with the execution of Robespierre, we are beyond anything that happens in A Tale of Two Cities, right? Our friends, the Manettes, escape from Paris at the height of the Reign of Terror. That's why Sidney, is going to lose his head to save Charles and make Lucy happy and all that great stuff. But just a couple other things here to wrap it up. You got a picture of Maximilian Robespierre, clearly cleaned up. Robespierre suffered, he caught smallpox when he was a child. Smallpox left you with a horribly scarred face. And his stare, some people said, was so intimidating that nobody won a staring contest against this guy. He was described as being almost cat-like. And then we have another piece of artwork depicting his capture and then finally his execution there in the lower right. What happened to some other people during this time? As I said, Louis XVII is going to die in prison. Later on, after the revolution, he's going to be given that title posthumously. so that we'll have another king who comes after Louis the 17th. I believe it's Charles the 10th. I'm not quite sure. My French history, shame on me, right? And then Napoleon Bonaparte, of course, everybody knows that name. Napoleon was a general in the army, fought very bravely, very well, became popular with the people. He was on the council, rose up in the council. Ultimately, he declared himself chief counsel, and then he declared himself emperor. So the people of France had this revolution to replace the king with a tyrant like Robespierre, killed him off. Louis the 17th never ruled, but he was a king. Napoleon Bonaparte becomes an emperor. He's going to lose. He's going to lose money in fighting these wars. He sells the Louisiana Territory to Thomas Jefferson. You know all about that. And then ultimately he crowns himself emperor, which is kind of a cool thing, not just grab that crown and say, I crown myself emperor. He is going to lose to Admiral Nelson of the British Army, and he's going to abdicate the throne. He's going to give it up in 1814. Now, just keep things in mind, French Revolution at this point must be officially over because 1812 is when we say it ends. That's the same year that Charles Dickens was born. So Napoleon is actually alive while Charles Dickens is alive. Napoleon abdicates, he gives up the throne, but he's not done yet. The people are going to say, well, somebody needs to rule us after they had all of this revolution. They look at the royal bloodline and they realize, oh, the Count of Provence, he's closest to becoming king right now, and they make him Louis the 18th. So even after Louis the 16th, we had a revolution to get rid of the kings. We have Louis the 17th, we have Louis the 18th, and we have an emperor. But Napoleon's going to come back one more time, rule for 100 more days before he's finally defeated at Waterloo, and he abdicates again. And this time they send him off to a tiny little island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean called St. Helena. He's going to live out his days there. Louis the 18th returns again. So he was king. He wasn't king. Now he is king again. And ultimately, unfortunately, when he dies, it's going to happen all again. Charles the 10th is going to come to the throne, and he's going to be overthrown. A new king, Louis Philippe, rises. This is the Orleans dynasty. There's a second republic declared. We had one republic, and now we got another one, but it's not over yet. In 1848, the barricades go up. Now, if you're familiar with Les Mis, the musical or the book, now we're getting into the era of revolutions that story is sent in. So France has had a lot of turmoil, and that's why we call the revolution in A Tale of Two Cities the Revolution of 1789, to keep it clear from the others. But in spite of all this attempt to get rights for people, it wasn't until 1944, the end, getting into the last year of World War II, that females in France even got the right to vote. All right, I know that was a lot. I geek out when it comes to historical stuff. And like I said, all you really need to know is what's going on when everybody's in France. You don't need to know all the details. I'm not going to quiz you on which king replaced which king, or whether it was the Jacobins or the Girondins who did X and Y or anything like that. Big ideas is what we want out of this, and that's all. So I hope you stayed with me till the end. If you didn't, you're not listening to me anymore. But if you did stay with me to the end, I thank you. I'm sorry this went long, but it was a lot of stuff, and I think it's kind of cool. I hope you thought it was at least a little bit cool. Stay good, be safe. I'll see you in class.